Hello and welcome to the latest seminar from the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, supporting new approaches to improve health and tackle inequality. At this chaired discussion, we explore how far Glasgow has come from 2003 to 2023 and ask what's changed and what now. This event was chaired by Professor Chick Collins, Director of Glasgow Centre for Population Health, and features 4 keynote speakers: Manira Ahmad, Chief Officer, Public Health Scotland; Colin Edgar, Director of Communications and Corporate Governance at Glasgow City Council; Anna Fowley, Chief Executive of Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations; and Stuart Patrick, Chief Executive of Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. This seminar was recorded in front of a live audience in Glasgow as part of the GCPH Seminar Series on the 12th of October 2023.
We've got a group of speakers here today who are going to speak to this theme, Glasgow 2003 to 2023, and I'll introduce them in due course when it comes time for them to speak, but I'm sure everyone's looking forward to hearing from them. But I've been asked to set a little bit of a context in these initial stages of the discussion, just to kind of get us ready for some of the discussion that will take place and to set a context for our speakers. So Scotland, 2003. There isn't actually yet a thing called a Scottish Government. There's a thing called a Scottish Executive. And its incumbent First Minister, in fact the third First Minister, is Jack McConnell. He'd been preceded by Donald Dewar and Henry McLeish. The leader of Glasgow City Council, can anyone remember? Bit of audience participation here. Shout it out.
Charlie Gordon.
Yeah, Charlie Gordon. So, both Labour in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. Both white men, and a mix probably of old Labour and new Labour. Remember when we used to speak in those terms. We don't yet have these things called community planning partnerships in Scotland yet. They've just been legislated for. They're coming soon. But we do still have things called social inclusion partnerships. Remember them? Although they've just been subjected to an unusually critical external evaluation by Cambridge Economic Associates. Something's in the air. A consultation, relatedly, has just begun on a thing called, or things called, urban regeneration companies. Sounds a bit like those urban development corporations that were in England in the 1980s and 1990s, which some people in Scotland had been quite happy not to have. So, something's in the air. Scottish executive policy is centred, everything, around economic development. There's a document which is the basis of that called A Smart, Successful Scotland. Do you remember that? Linked to another document called the Framework for Economic Development in Scotland, FEDES. In the preceding years, there's been a massive expansion of banking and finance in the Scottish economy. Many people are feeling very proud about the 2 big Scottish entities, the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Bank of Scotland. And in fact, the former, the Royal Bank of Scotland, has become, by some accounts, the 5th biggest bank in the world at that particular moment in time. But there's more concern about the 2 other, what have been leading sectors of the Scottish economy at that time. And those are, firstly, electronics and computing. Silicon Glen is in sharp decline. In a very few years, between 2000 and 2003, output has fallen by a half. Oil and gas is in decline. In one way, some of this at least seems as if it could be good news for Glasgow. Because for 4 decades, no less than 4 decades, the city of Glasgow has been on the end of a highly prejudicial policy agenda being driven from Edinburgh by the Scottish Office and then later also by the Scottish Executive. New towns and inward investment have been the priorities, and Glasgow has lost out to that hugely. Quite soon, though, cities will be becoming back into economic vogue as Scotland embraces what was then called the new conventional wisdom that cities, rather than new towns and other growth areas, are the key drivers of regional and national economic growth and development. Something's in the air. In fact, a refreshed version of both A Smart, Successful Scotland and the framework for economic development in Scotland is about to emerge, with some new emphases, including the importance of cities. But what a legacy of damage the city of Glasgow is carrying from the combined effects of that new town policy and the impacts of the recessions and deindustrialisations of the 1980s and 1990s. Just a few figures. 42% less working residents in Glasgow in 2001 than had been the case in 1971. 42%. Glasgow, with 11.4% of the Scottish population, has 70% of Scotland's most deprived 5% areas. 70% of the 5% most deprived in a city with 11% of the population. There's a growing perception of a problem being called worklessness, as well as very big problems of family breakdown, educational attainment, and as a way of crystallising all of this, health and mortality. The phenomenon of excess mortality is beginning to be described, still yet to be explained. And the closer one gets to Glasgow in 2003, the worse that problem gets, the worse many of these problems get. Now, in my mind at least, I can't dissociate the creation of the Glasgow Centre for Population Health for this context. This was not the first time, the first point at which the scale of the problems in Glasgow were being noticed. But it was the first time in 4 decades that Glasgow had at least some degree of relative priority in thinking about national economic development and growth. Something had to be done. Something had to be done quite quickly, and some new thinking was needed. And GCPH is created in that context, and it's not entirely, a random occurrence in my mind. Now, what was to come, how things have changed where we are at now, that's what our speakers are going to address today from their own perspectives, their own experiences. We're not asking them to, explain it all away and describe every aspect, but to give us some insight from the perspective of their own organisational context and the sectors which they represent over that period of time. I'm sure we're looking forward to hearing all about that from our speakers. But before I go on, I've been asked to say something as well about the GCPH perspective on the health outcomes of the city over that period and our understanding of their causes. So I would divide that from my perspective, and although I'm new to GCPH, I did have a longer-term association with GCPH as a collaborator on some of the research that was done over a period of years. I would describe the main stages as this. Firstly, in the early stages, identifying and describing the outcomes in terms of lagging health improvement in Scotland and Glasgow. Things getting better here, slower than they were getting better in other places. Also in terms of the scale of health inequalities, very significant. The changing patterns of causes of death, with the rising significance of the category of external causes. People who are dying due to alcohol, drugs, suicide, and violence. Also, the impacts on the different demographics in the city and that phenomenon of excess mortality. Linked to that, something which is foundational for GCPH is the consistent projection of a proper, evidence-based understanding that these outcomes are socially determined. They are not the result of freely determined individual choices or lifestyles or behaviours which are somehow amenable to a bit of education or a bit of nudging, or at least not very amenable in the absence of a wider addressing of the broader social determinants of health. The next stage towards explanation, and here I can focus on that phenomenon of excess mortality, because we found that excess mortality, especially in Glasgow, was not just what was initially hypothesised as the aftershock of deindustrialisation, but to a large extent it was the outcome of that long-term, deeply embedded national commitment to a version of regional economic development, new towns and other growth areas, which did not, over the long term, serve Scotland as a whole well, but which did a lot of very serious harm to the city of Glasgow. And that was the story that we would have been telling 10 years ago at GCPH, the old story, as we now call it, a story of lagging health improvement, stark inequalities, deaths of despair, excess mortality. But there's a new story, and it's a story which we've been telling, I think, for maybe about 5 years now. A story of pretty unprecedented, arguably jaw-dropping, lack of health improvement, or actual, for some significant groups of the population, deterioration in population health, concentrated in the most deprived communities, and therefore leading to an exacerbation of the already significant health inequalities in our city, and ongoing intensification of deaths of despair. All of this driven by an accumulation of factors: the banking collapse, the Great Recession, many years of austerity, Brexit, the COVID pandemic, the cost of living crisis, but especially and above all, driven by government austerity coming in particular from Westminster. And that will be the subject of the next seminar, when David Walsh and Jerry McCartney will be coming along here in a couple of months. I'll give the dates out later, to describe and explain these latest trends. So I guess the question, no pressure guys, for you all to address is, how did we get from that optimistic context of the early noughties? Something was in the air, things were going to improve, there was optimism about making poverty history, about evidence-based policy making, about the end of boom and bust and there never being another recession. How did we get from there to here, these outcomes which I've just described, and how has that looked and felt and been experienced by you from your own organisational perspective? And first of all, to address this question, I'd like to invite Colin Edgar. So Colin is the Director of Communication and Corporate Governance at Glasgow City Council. Colin's role encompasses communication, HR, community empowerment, financial inclusion and transformation. And before joining the Council in 2006, Colin worked in communication with BAE Systems in the Labour Party, as well as working as a radio and TV producer at BBC Scotland. And it says here, in his spare time, and that you just can't help but like him, he reads, he bakes, he rides various types of bikes, follows his children around the house switching off lights, and volunteers at bike races. Not why we invited you, but it doesn't hurt. Yeah?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chick. I have to apologise. I am not who was advertised originally. My colleague, Dr. Duncan Booker, had to pull out at the last minute. I understand the question, and I understand it better now that Chick has asked it. I haven't had a long time to think about it, so I'm excited to find out, while I'm on my feet, what I actually think about that question. To the extent that things have got worse in the last 20 years, Chick has just set it out. Let me give a little bit more of a perspective on my part, because I feel generally good about the last 20 years, and I feel generally positive about the future. But I'm not Pollyanna-ish. We need to accept that some things have got worse. They've got worse relatively. 20 years ago, in 2003, for me, the key change at that time was Glasgow was emerging from a period of either deliberate or close to deliberate managed decline, which had essentially been government policy for 50 years, Chick, is that fair? Again, the GCPH's synthesis on the causes of excess mortality is quite an old document now, but it's a really good one, and I would urge anyone that hasn't read it yet to have a look at it. That had impacts on health at a population level, I think both by causing harm directly to individuals, but also by removing people from the population who would otherwise have frankly made the figures look slightly better. Back in 2003, we were starting to get away from that. Now, none of these things hang entirely on personalities, but the personalities are important. I don't want to criticise Charlie Gordon. I don't think Charlie was a bad leader of the council, but the leader of the council who came after him, Stephen Purcell, decided that he wanted to be the leader of the city, not the leader of the council. He wasn't just going to spend his time thinking about the council. He wanted to think about the city as a whole, essentially completing the journey that Michael Kelly had started on in the 1980s with Glasgow's Miles Better. Now, you can have a view about whether Stephen succeeded in that or not, but certainly by making the attempt, it made a difference. So that's one personality that made a difference. I think the other personality that made a difference was the First Minister, Janet McConnell, and coincidentally his wife, Bridget McConnell, because around about that time, the other thing that was happening was Glasgow was getting uppity and daring to imagine that we could host the Commonwealth Games in 2014. Now, you can have a view about whether mega events actually contribute to the city that hosts them, and you can have a view about whether legacy is a real thing. But what I would argue to you is that taking the decision to bid to host the Commonwealth Games, winning that bid handsomely, internally, because remember we had to beat Edinburgh, and then externally, where we beat I can't remember exactly how many cities it was that started off bidding. Eventually we came through, and hosting the Games, that was the beginning of the city saying, no, we are confident. We are not this post-industrial city that people seem to believe we are. And I think that was an important part of turning around how the city felt about itself, how it behaved, and how the larger body politic, whether that was the Scottish Executive, later the Scottish Government, or the UK Government, came to feel about us. So I feel pretty good about the past 20 years. So you guys said 5 minutes, and I didn't look at my watch when I stood up, but you'll wave at me if I'm in trouble.
Got another couple of minutes.
So, as Chick said, in the middle of all of that period, we get this massive kind of the opposite of Keynesianism. We get a huge amount of money taken out of the economy very, very quickly, almost overnight, from 2008 onwards when the Great Recession happens. I don't think the city, in the 5 years previous to that, had recovered enough from the previous 50 years of managed decline to have the resilience to carry on the trajectory that we were on. And I would argue, I would suggest, that contributes to, in large part, the slowing of the increase in Glasgow. Other places suffered from austerity as well. English cities had a much quicker shock than we did. They lost money much more quickly than we did, and yet they seemed able to be more resilient than we were. So I think the journey is one where we are getting better and more confident, but there are reasons why that journey was, I don't think, stalled. Very quickly looking ahead to the next couple of years. This week, the Council has published the 4th iteration of our annual report on child poverty. It doesn't make tremendously cheerful reading, as you might imagine. It's quite radical in how we are doing it. It's actually really hard to get good data about child poverty. We're starting to get a grip on it. We're starting to understand who the kids are, what their families look like, where they are in the city. We are still largely blind on ethnicity, and there are reasons for that, and we're trying to get through that. But what we've learned is that rates of child poverty, so the absolute numbers are improving, but the relative numbers are not. The rates are not improving. But you would expect them to be worse, right? Because the economy is not getting massively better. We still haven't recovered from the pandemic. We certainly haven't recovered from what the UK government did to the economy last year. So you would expect the numbers to be getting worse, and they're not. I suspect we are beginning to see the impact. The answers are never simple, but here's a simple thing. I think we're beginning to see the early green shoots of the impact of the Scottish Child Payment, and that the idea that simply transferring cash to families in experiencing poverty can have a pretty outsized impact. It will take another couple of years to see that feed through, to find out if that's actually the case. But you have to take good news where you get it, don't you? And for me, the fact that you would expect things to be getting worse and yet they are not is a positive sign. So that's it for me. We should feel good about what has come in the last 20 years, because it was an improvement on 50 years of decline, and we should allow ourselves to feel relatively positive about what might happen in the coming years. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. So now I'd like to invite Anna Fowley to come forward. Anna is the Chief Executive of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations and has been there since 2018. Before that, Chief Executive of the Scottish Social Services Council for nearly 9 years. So a real grounding in the voluntary sector, the third sector, to speak from. So thanks for helping us with this today.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Chick, for making me feel really, really old. So I remember all of those things you were talking about, but not quite as old as when we had, a few weeks ago, had a 20-year-old, 19-year-old intern who asked me about the history of procurement and how it worked. And I went, well, let me tell you about when competitive tendering came in under Margaret Thatcher. That's when I was working. And sat back to take notes for several hours. But I suppose I really enjoyed what you said, Colin, as well, because I was thinking that what you talked about confidence in a city also applies to individuals and to families, that kind of it's that self-confidence and self-belief that actually helps people to be optimistic for the future. And some other time, I'll take contention with your stuff about cities. As someone who grew up in the Highlands, quite a lot of poverty and inequality in rural areas and island communities, and cities aren't always the answer. However, Inverness is pretending to be one now, so we'll just enjoy that. So my first response, I've probably used up all my minutes now, have I? Wittering. My first response really to being invited here by Jenny was, why me? Because it will become entirely evident shortly, I'm not an expert in either health inequalities or Glasgow, but I was very much involved in the Health Foundation's report published last year called Leave No One Behind, and I think that evidenced what we really have all felt in our hearts, and some people like GCPH have known with absolute evidence, that really the story isn't very uplifting. So despite lots of progressive legislation and policies, despite being a relatively wealthy country, despite all the wealth of knowledge that's available to us now, health inequalities have got worse. And that is particularly true in Glasgow and its surrounding areas, but it's true across the country. And in his introduction to that Health Foundation report, Chris Cregan said that a healthier, fairer nation is possible, but he asks whether, despite our good intentions, we've taken our eye off the ball. I think we've spent a lot of time describing the ball, but we've not really spent enough time kicking it into the back of the net. There are really good things happening in local areas, but I think mainly what I'm thinking about is the stuff that happens at a national level in Scottish terms. And when thinking about what the challenges are, I kind of nearly said, I'll just get up and say poverty and welfare reform, so-called welfare reform, and sit back down again, because I think that's kind of what it's largely been about. But well, I'm too vain to do that. I'll have to speak a wee bit. But I think the key challenge, as everyone said already, is poverty. It's intractable, multi-generational and increasing poverty, increasing inequality in terms of poverty. And all of that has been, both poverty and inequalities have been exacerbated by the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, but we can't pretend they were the causes. 20 years ago, you know, it was already pretty bleak even just before those things. But 20 years ago, we were seeing child poverty reduce. That's your point, Colin, I think was exactly where I was starting from. that was a time of optimism. There was a general long-term trend of improvement in standards of living. When the Scottish Parliament was re-established in 1999, there was a real feeling of optimism about the future. Then there was the crash in 2008, and subsequent austerity measures from the UK government, including welfare reform, really put us into reverse gear. And we still live in an economic system that grows the wealth of a few already rich people and equates success with having lots of money and lots of possessions. If Scotland's really serious about being a well-being economy, then we really have to grasp the fact that GDP, all that kind of economic measure, isn't the be-all and end-all. And in fact, everyone, including commercial businesses, benefit if society is fairer, if it's healthier, if it's greener, and if we tackle inequalities. I think I've reluctantly come to accept that if we use the words improving the economy rather than tackling inequality, we might make more progress with it. At the very least, I think we need to stop implementing public policy that actively and deliberately harms people's health and well-being. For example, how the benefits system operates in the UK, how we treat asylum seekers and refugees, and how not providing decent social housing. Even without the moral argument, it's expensive, and we spend billions of pounds mitigating the harm that the state has perpetuated. If you're familiar with the promise that emerged from the Independent Care Review, you'll know that the work on the human and economic cost model contained in its reports the money and follow the money very clearly how and why we should urgently move to a preventative approach. Even if we forget about making people's lives better and it just being the right thing for children, it's actually a much better use of money. It's a proper investment. So I think we need to take a much longer term, more strategic, coherent approach that's focused on improving outcomes and experiences and not on organisational boundaries and separate policies and separate activities. We need to think about the whole person, the whole community, the whole country. And we need to actually implement the stuff that we've got. We need to implement the legislation and the policies that we have, like community empowerment and parity of esteem across different parts of the ecosystem. And it is really hard not to be despondent, not when you're sitting next to Colin, but it's hard not to be despondent when you're looking at these issues. But I do think there is some hope. When I first got involved in the Health Foundation work, I would have said that public attitudes would have been a significant barrier to change. Actually, the research with the public in the work that produced that report found that people often started off thinking that health inequality was about individual life choices. But the more informed they became, the more they talked about it, the more they understood the systemic issues much more deeply, and the more unacceptable they found the current situation. They started off thinking the system issues were about funding for the NHS, but they quickly understood that prevention, including through resource redistribution, was really important. And in terms of our sector, I think all of this has placed a massive burden, an increasing burden on most of our sector, particularly as public finances have contracted and particularly as local government has struggled to deliver their statutory duties, never mind all of the other good stuff that they do. And that has transferred some of that activity at a very low cost onto the voluntary sector. But the sector is really adaptable, really resilient, often provides things to a much higher standard than other other sectors might do, but it's undervalued and under-resourced. And very optimistic. It's one of those things when we do all our kind of research with the sector, everyone's always saying, oh, it's terrible, there's no money. How confident are you in terms of the future? Very, very confident, very confident. So there's a kind of strange kind of juxtaposition there of hope, triumphing over pragmatism, I think. But I suppose that's what I would say to sum up is we've got loads of research, we've got loads of evidence, we've got lots of really good policy, we've got all that stuff. We just need to JFDI.
Thank you, Anna. Next up, we have Stuart Patrick, who I guess will be known to most people here. Stuart is the Chief Executive of the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. So, yeah, come ahead, Stuart.
Thank you. You've also made me feel also slightly old, and I remember the URCs being set up. I am a board member of the Clyde Gateway, which is the last surviving of those URCs. It was another of the fashions of policy that came and went. And I'm afraid I'm really sad that it did, because the Clyde Gateway, in my experience, has been a very successful targeted delivery vehicle to make things happen on a holistic basis in one of the most challenging parts of Glasgow. But I'll leave that as a wee aside for further discussion. Given my role at the Chamber of Commerce, when Chick asked me to come, and this is partly on the back of Chick and I and our teams beginning to explore where might there be commonality of interest between a Chamber of Commerce, which of course is representative of rampant capitalism and profit making, and some of the issues of the city, which we are all aware affect ability not just of the communities and the people of Glasgow to succeed, but also the businesses of this city. And I wanted to make a couple of points around that that I think are very interesting to me, and we felt that Chick and his team would be able to help us understand why this particular set of issues is happening. So I might say that main change from 2003, I'd have to say that at that stage, the early stages perhaps of what might be the city's economic recovery were really only getting started from around about the mid-1990s. I remember 1996 it was, the Daily Record put out a headline, "Glasgow's miles worse." And we spent a day going out saying, well, hang on a minute, actually a lot of the trends on the ground are suggesting that it's picking up. It was always that Edinburgh's doing better and Glasgow's doing a lot worse. And actually on the ground we were seeing beginnings of turn in employment statistics, and that perhaps we were overdoing the negativity on Glasgow. So here's a couple of thoughts. We were at the very early stages of the International Financial Services District, as Chick was saying earlier. Financial services was only just beginning. We were in a debate. I remember David sitting in the front here, and I remember having a good debate with David about were the jobs coming through in the IFSD, which at that time were a lot of call centre jobs, really going to be helpful to tackling the opportunities or providing opportunities, especially for the blue-collar workers that had fallen out of opportunities as the collapse of manufacturing. But we've now largely delivered the International Financial Services District as we had planned it at the beginning of the 2000s. We all know all the names now, the Barclays and JP Morgans, etc. And we delivered the 20,000 additional jobs and the change to the Broomielaw area. We now know Tradeston is beginning to see the impact of that as well. But we were always uncomfortable that we were about to commit the sin that we were simply moving from one industry over-dependence to another industry over-dependence, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But as I look back over that time and ask the economic question, I had a wee look at the regional economic stats from the Scottish Government that were just sent around recently, and I'm looking at a regional level, and here is one big change. We are talking much more about collaborative working at a regional level, city regional level, than we were in 2003, and we're looking at ways in which we can make that work for the whole region, economically and, I have to say, socially and environmentally. But here's some interesting messages. The Glasgow City Region territory, which we know is the 8 local authorities, including Glasgow City Council, GCR employment is up 12% since 2010. Against up 9% for Scotland, and actually close to Edinburgh's increase, its city region increase, around 13%. At 892,000 jobs in the region, that's the highest it's been over that period. Working age employment rate is up 4.4 points to 73.3%, and that's also well ahead of the increase of 1.7 points for Scotland. So we've cut the gap from 3.7 points to 1 point. Unemployment rate, down from 6% to 3.2%. Economic inactivity, down less impressively, and this is a critical point, down from 26.7% to 24.3%. But it's actually down faster than the Scottish level, still recognised as far too high in the Glasgow region economic strategy. So the overall story of the economics over the 2010 period to 2023 suggests that actually Glasgow City Region's been doing relatively well in Scottish terms. That sounds unlikely, given so much of the conversation we have about how is Glasgow doing these days. But it fits with the feedback I have with so many of the Chamber members right now in sectors across financial services, construction, engineering, maritime. They can't find talent. There's 100 welder jobs up for grabs down at BAE Systems right now. I challenge you to get your roof repaired in a swift period of time right now, because jobs in construction are not being filled at the pace that demand is asking them to be filled. And it's not simply a question of skills of the hand, it's also skills of the mind, and you can't easily get the jobs to be filled in financial services that we were building through the IFSD right now, which is possibly one of the reasons why Glasgow has been one of the slowest cities in the UK to return to the office. Glasgow is back. We have a survey of return to the office across the UK. Glasgow's maybe back, maybe a day, 2.5 a week on average to the office, whereas around the rest of the UK, it's heading more 2.5 to 3 days a week. And part of that is you talk to the senior employers of companies in, for example, the financial services, they say, very reluctant to try and push our staff to come back. That's what the staff want to do, so we're going to go with it. So it just shows you that the balance of power at the moment is with staff, not with the employer. That's because of that shortage of skills that I'm mentioning earlier. But that other change about the dependence on any one sector, I would suggest is important. That transition from heavy manufacturing to Silicon Glen, as Chick was saying, to financial services, that was always a risk. And now I think there's some genuine signs of Glasgow finding a new role, a fresh role, in the higher skill science and tech industries, the science and tech-based businesses. Here we are in the Technology and Innovation Centre as one example of an asset that's been delivered in that 2003 to 2023 period that demonstrates that change. We've got new clusters of engineering, of advanced manufacturing, of health and life sciences, all beginning to emerge, that new wave of emerging businesses. And I go back to those regional economic stats. High growth businesses up from 490 in 2003 to 610, up 25%. That's faster than Scotland, and it's actually faster than Edinburgh. Although the pandemic did take a big toll on the numbers for those businesses, we actually had reached a high of 845 before the pandemic. But also the number of VAT-registered businesses in Glasgow City region, up from 42,000 to 52,000, up 22%, getting close to double the rate of what the increase has been at the Scottish level. So I would argue that we've got a very, very robust opportunity with the city region. We've got a lot of skills demand, and one of the challenges at the very beginning at 2003 was there's not enough jobs to be able to tackle that embedded disadvantage and poverty. But now we appear to have not enough talent to fill the jobs. How do we make the two come together? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Stuart. And I'm sure people are incubating questions for our speakers as we work our way through. And our final speaker today is Manira Ahmad. Manira is the Chief Officer at Public Health Scotland, had a varied career history spanning both the private and public sectors, focusing on systems, emotional architecture and the importance of lived experience. But most importantly at the moment, the Chief Officer of Public Health Scotland. Manira has hurt her ankle, but she's managed to be here notwithstanding. Got a few painkillers in the system?
A few is an understatement.
A few is an understatement. So, yeah. So we're really delighted that you were still able to, make it along today despite your injury. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then apologies, colleagues, I'm not in top form because I don't have my heels on today. So I feel we'll be on my tiptoe on my right foot. Firstly, a massive thank you, Chick, to yourself, to Pete, to Jenny, to Carol, to invite me along today. I always feel very honoured to come into spaces where there's people in the room that have bigger brains than me. So please bear with me as I take you through. And I do have a few slides, and hopefully they'll just move on. Are they they are fabulous. That's great. To the speakers before me, Colin, Anna and Stuart, you said you were my warm-up act. You've now made my job even harder because you've talked, so I was writing this down when you guys, you were talking, so you've talked about prevention, redistribution, the wicked challenges, the confidence in the system, being action-focused, cross-sectorial partnerships, workforce, local, regional, national partnerships. And a lot of that, all of us are grappling with within our day jobs or our personal lives. But the first thing I was asked is to reflect when I was asked to come along, what did I feel? And it was literally that. What am I going to tell people that they don't already know? Now, hearing from my colleague speakers there, so I thought I would maybe step back a little and talk about some of the wider challenges faced in Scotland, because what happens somewhere else has an indirect and direct consequence to us living in our local spaces. So we know around about life expectancy, and some of that was touched earlier on, that people in Scotland are dying younger, and that continues to happen compared to the Western world. We also know after decades of improvement, Scotland's health is worsening. And colleagues talked about that. It is worsening. In health, not in its purest sense, but in the wider determinants. People are dying younger. The number of people dying earlier is increasing, and those within the most deprived areas in Scotland, in particular in Glasgow, and I live in Barrhead. I'm not sure if anybody here is from Barrhead as well. So, oh, there we go, hello. My dad's picking me up later if you want to lift back. So people in some of the most deprived areas have the poorest health outcomes. We talk about workforce, we talk about things that have improved, things that we need to be doing, and these fundamental wicked challenges still exist within our systems. Chick very helpfully highlighted, my career didn't start within health. And actually Public Health Scotland wasn't even part of the system, though part of the reform journey, yes, but that Public Health Scotland only came into fruition 3 years ago. And I guess spanning the private sector and coming into the public sector, what I've noticed is that really important bit that Stuart talked about, cross-sectorial partnership, it is key. Not one sector alone can solve the issues we have in Glasgow and rightly and also across Scotland. And apologies, there's more visualities in my slides than there are words. And this kind of talks about what we knew even 20 years ago and where we are sitting right now. The actual years in good health have not improved. So if you take the bottom bar there about poorest females, so I'm in Barrhead, one of the most deprived areas. 20 years ago, I would have roughly about 30 years, less years in good health, and that really hasn't improved. And if I think about my age, not that I'm going to tell you what it is standing up here, but I'm not far off of going into that light blue bar. Not far off at all. And as you've heard before, after decades of improvement, life expectancy has not increased, but some things have changed. The system has listened. So I remember in Glasgow when I first started within the health and care space, speaking to colleagues within Glasgow City, and actually being a resident of Glasgow City at that point as well, is that in Glasgow we talked about integration before it was called a thing of integration. We came together under health, care and community before it was known and before even the Health and Social Care Integration Act came into force in 2015 and 2016. And that said, the impact on population health does vary even within Glasgow. However, I have confidence, and that word's been used, I do really have confidence because there is bouts of geniusness and magic that happens already and is continuing to happen. And there is a role for not just Public Health Scotland, but for every single person in this room, is how do we share, spread and scale that by bespoking that for communities. And you'll see here around the impact on population health, spanning from primary prevention into tertiary prevention. And Anna, you talked about voluntary and third sector. My first role in health and care was working in the local system, so employed by the national infrastructure. I was deployed into local systems, and some of you in this room I had managed to connect with and work alongside, and to me that was a privilege. So I know within the local systems that is where the change happens, and I don't think, and Chick, you were talking about how Glasgow has moved on. I think we do need to celebrate in bouts that things have moved and have changed, but we still have a journey to go. I'm hoping some of this will help stimulate conversation and discussion around the theory of causation here, that actually both upstream and downstream, both bits of that juggling sphere need to be impacted. And we know that even in the next 20 years, the burden on the health and care system is going to increase by 21%. We know that. Yet, we focus on the sharp end. Not everywhere, but in a lot of the time it's the sharp end. And not stepping back, looking at the prevention and early intervention. And that's where the evidence, and as I say, some of my colleague speakers touched on this, the evidence and the data and the research and the lived experience we all have a vital role to play in it. I'm not going to talk much about this because my colleagues have very eloquently touched on a lot of these things. And I guess for me, and I rewrote some of what I was going to talk today because I was at a council forum for schools yesterday, just last night. And one thing they talked about was about everyone attaining, everyone achieving through excellence experiences. And it's back to that point that I really caught on to. It's about everyone. So how do we bespoke every single bit of our system to ensure not that everybody has an equitable access, that the barriers are removed. This is my last slide.
Okay.
And this is just a reminder that came out of the King's Fund around the what shapes our health. And for me, and this is more to remind myself as well as others, that the top 70% is around behaviours, which we have a massive opportunity to impact. And Stuart, on your point around both public and private sector influence those behaviours. And some of them have been very positive, and there's some examples up there, but there's a lot more to go. And around the social and the economic factors as well. And both Colin and Anna touched on them as well. Thank you very much, Chuck.
Thank you very much.
Had I had slightly more time, I was going to mention the GHA actually, so I'm glad you did, Eddie. I was in Alex Salmon's bedroom in a hotel in Sri Lanka after midnight when he agreed to complete the M74. I was actually there when he agreed to do it. We do need to fix the city's connectivity. What I would say is, we give over too much space to cars, and one of the things that's happened in the last 20 years has been the growth in cars. And when we look back on all those pictures of Glasgow in the 60s that we love, where we see, you know, Argyle Street full of people, and they didn't come by car, right? They came by tram or by train. Airport Rail Link, you're 100% right. There's been too much shilly-shallying around about that. The city was delighted to see the Clyde Metro included in STPR2, Strategic Transport Project. Somebody will tell me what STPR2 stands for. Strategic Transport Project Review, Round 2, earlier in the year. So we've had some significant movement on that. It's not going to see an extension of the subway, but it is going to see light rail, bus priority, potentially trams as well, out as far as the airport and possibly even further.
Just a couple of points. One, don't get me wrong, Clyde Gateway isn't going anywhere. It stays. It's still functioning well and has at least another 5 years to go. And I hope is extended because there's still a long way to go. But I actually agree entirely with you, David, that there should be more of those kinds of vehicles on the ground, making things happen in the most disadvantaged local communities. So totally agree with that. On the transport point, You might expect me to be a vigorous proponent of the car, and I will say one thing that we've always got to remember, that decentralisation of Glasgow that we carried out in the 40s, the 50s and 60s was designed around the car. We haven't undesigned it, so those communities still depend on their car largely to be able to get to work and to do all the various things they want to do to service their families. So we can't just rush to all the measures to try and force people out their cars without getting the investment in public transport. Absolutely right, and we're too slow on that. And perhaps the most substantially challenging part of that is the decline of the bus network and the loss of something like 100 million bus passenger trips that goes behind that. And the communities that suffer most from that are the most disadvantaged communities. So we've got a bus partnership fund. I think it's 500 million out there. It's been kicking around for 4 years. We've spent 26 million out of that so far. We were just not moving fast enough in order to be able to improve the quality of public transport in our region. So can we, A, get that bus partnership on the ground, improving the quality of the bus journey, making the bus journey times faster, going alongside a lot of the investment that bus companies have made in their stock? Can we please move faster on that? And can we get the Clyde Metro delivered? That would include a connection to the airport. It's not quite the connection we had in mind when we were lobbying for it 20 years ago, but it is a connection, it's a start to get that done. But it's a much, much wider project than that one line because we have this significant challenge of connecting one part of the region to another part of the region. Everything goes through the city centre. We need a set of public transport options that allow you to get from different parts of the region without always having to come through the city centre. So can we move a bit faster on this? I know I'm always being told by the government that we need to recognise the changes that are occurring in the economy and the changes in the balance of importance between social and environmental and economic and what's happened after the pandemic, and we need to get up with the programme. But at the same time, I'm asking, have you changed any of the processes for investing in public transport since before the pandemic, since before the net zero crisis was clarified? Have we changed? Have we made any of them faster? I don't think so. I'll pass it back. Someone may be able to tell me if we have.
Maybe we can take that as a moment, maybe just to open up a question, I think, which is, in terms of the good stories that are coming out there about the things that are happening in Glasgow in particular, why is that at this stage not feeding through in the way that we would want it to into the population health outcomes? And I guess the question that we'll be ending on is, how do we make that work better in the future? But maybe is there a question on the negative side, why is it not feeding through at the moment? And just open that to all of you, really. Yeah.
Can I just go very, very quickly? It's very quickly, and a slight response to the chap who described himself as a gatecrasher. We do know the child poverty numbers. I don't have the absolute figures to hand. As I say, the absolute figures have gone down, but the relative figure remains at about 24%, which is too high. What I was talking about is the data is difficult to come by. So what we're learning is about the makeup of the families that those children sit in, and the depth of the poverty, the extent to which they sit below the poverty line. And in a sense, that's the answer to Chick's question. So rates of poverty are relatively unchanged. There are some sections of society where the depth of the poverty is increasing. That comes down to austerity. So the opportunities that are there aren't feeding through into people don't have an ability to take the opportunities that are there. That's because of the depth of poverty. It's because of ill health. That feeds through to why you can't get a roofer, because Glasgow's rates of poverty lead to rates of ill health. The rates of ill health lead to low rates of productivity. The low rates of productivity, and you're in a negative cycle, and you can't generate enough people to take the opportunities that are out there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Manira.
Thanks, Colin, and thank you for the questions. I actually think we all need to be constructively challenging to each other, but in a respectful way. So I welcome all the questions that have came in. I can't answer all of them, but I'm sure some of the other panellists as well. But following on from your, Colin, if I can, around public health and, you know, why things have or haven't worked in Glasgow. And I'm minded, even in the last decade, during the public health reform discussions, we had them in Glasgow. So not just for Glasgow, but for Scotland. We had them in Glasgow, just up the road in Buchanan Street, or just off that. And a number of those discussions influenced what happened with public health reform, and then came on the bit around Public Health Scotland being formed. And it's, though a new organisation, it's not new resource or new money. It's realigning and redistributing. So that's where the constructive challenge came into the system. We don't have more. So how do we stop doing things that aren't impactful and aren't making a change for us within localities? And I'm happy to pick up with yourself and tell you the 3 organisations that came together to make Public Health Scotland, just of time check. I won't go through it here. But what I can say is that every day we are asked, even within our national infrastructures, what should we stop? What should we realign, and where does the focus need to be? And one of the big focuses for us in Public Health Scotland, not the only one of the big ones, is that we know change happens in the community. So we are now working with and still developing the local arm to public health. So we're not talking about sitting in our own buildings trying to think of how to do this, but actually deploying the resources. This is back to realigning, deploying the resources. Some of you will be working with us already within your local systems around what's the evidence telling us, what's the research telling us, and how do we make a difference together. I'll stop there, just conscious of time, if others want to talk.
Stuart, something to say in response to what we've heard from the audience?
Yeah, this is, as I said at the beginning, Glasgow's not my main area of expertise. However, I would say when you were talking about the rise in the number of working age people, which is fantastic, and Glasgow's got a great story to tell on that, I'll go back to my previous comments about the system through which people come in. So one, there's Brexit, so we have got a different type of people coming in, and a lot of people who've left. That's why there's something like 30% less bus drivers in Edinburgh than there are, fewer bus drivers than there used to be. But there's also, when we bring people, we welcome people in Scotland, and particularly in Glasgow, and yet the system prevents them from working, actively excludes them from working, even from volunteering, and they're paid a subsistence level. So the state, the benefit system, is creating destitution. Yeah. Why is that a good thing? Those people aren't even allowed to participate in employability programmes till they've got a different immigration status. That's just wrong. And I know it's been particularly prevalent in Glasgow, but there are other parts of Scotland where, you know, come from the Highlands, there's quite a lot of been a lot of successful inward migration there, in Dumfries and Galway and others. But obviously Glasgow's is a place that people want to be, apart from anything else. On the transport issue, we have to move away from a reliance on cars, and the people who are most excluded from the employment market, and that's a cyclical thing about which comes first, the poor health or the poor employment engagement, are the people who don't have cars. So it's not helping to build more roads, it's not helping to be more accessible to cars. What helps is what you talked about, Stuart, is building transport, public transport. There's a dearth of public transport. We are lucky in Edinburgh, even despite the now lack of bus drivers. However, as I say, in the Highlands, there's nothing. Glasgow's been really hit by troubles in public transport. We really need to focus on that, because that's what helps not only the environment, but it helps people who need to get into work. Okay.
Yeah, and Stuart?
I'll maybe just pick up on a couple of points. Jamie's point about the in-migration, I think, is a very important one, and one we should be positive about. I do quite a bit of travelling because of the nature of the Chamber of Commerce, trying to encourage international trading links. And earlier in the year, I was in South Korea, and the interest they had in Glasgow and our ability to accommodate changes in industry. They're moving from heavy industry to service sector in the way that we'd had to do far too quickly and with not the help of policy that we could have liked, but they're going to go through the same issue. But the challenge they face way above that is their demographic collapse is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, we're looking in a couple of decades that could be down 40% of their population. It's massive. We don't face that. Or we talk about some demographic changes we will have to cope with, but we're still getting in migration in a way that a lot of the Asian communities don't. So that's an interesting and positive thing that we need to support and continue. Things like post-study work visa policy changes, I think, are potentially part of helping that to happen. But before I start going into universities, I just want to say a thing about colleges, because I think one of the other stats that should be worrying for Glasgow is the number of the working age population with no qualifications whatsoever. It's disproportionately high across the UK. We've got a disproportionately high number of people in the working age populations with degree level qualifications and above. So we have the most unequal labour market in the country as a consequence of those two different stats. But the question I then had is, why is the existing skills system not tackling that at the pace that we need it to? And if with demand there for those skills, why has that not been the case? The Withers report that came out relatively recently asking for changes in the skills system, whether you agree with what's in it or not, it offers an opportunity for us to change some of the support to colleges. Colleges are tied in knots. They're overly bureaucratized. They have very limited resource to be able to flex to meet market demand for skills as they arise. Can we fix that? Oh, and by the way, when we are making budget changes, I'm not against the increasing welfare bill that is coming through, but can we make sure it isn't at the expense of education and skills?
This isn't a desperately exciting answer, but it takes on from what Stuart has just said. As we start to really get so if child poverty is one of the drivers of general poverty and poverty is one of the drivers of ill health, as we start to really get into the guts of how we tackle child poverty, it's about more simplicity in the system. The child payment is going to work. Can we just find a way to put more money into the pockets of poor families? And in a short number of years, we will see health in this city and across the country improve.
Yeah, so do I. The cash first approach is something that I think across our sector certainly would be supported. There is evidence from the Trussell Trust that in where the and it's a clear causal link in terms of timings and everything. When the child payment was introduced and then increased in Scotland, the rise in use of food banks is much lower than in other parts of the UK. So there's still a rise, which is bad, but it's much lower, and it seems to really tie to that, the child payment. So that's a good thing. I think that we really have to do what everyone's talking about and get on with working together and really focus on addressing poverty. I think we are getting in a bit of a, child poverty is a good one to focus on, but we get ourselves in knots talking about fuel poverty, child poverty, internet poverty or whatever, and actually it's about poverty. So how do we address those things? If we focus on children, that helps because it's easier to get through some of the doubters, I suppose. But we really have to look at the benefit system and how the UK government operates in terms of benefits as well.
I'm definitely not the expert in how you tackle health inequalities, so I can only come at this by saying I would rather like to think that if we are in a situation where we now have the jobs we said we didn't have before, what can we do more to try and make that connection between the most disadvantaged and the job opportunities? And let's not be hung up by the notion that some of those job opportunities are quite high skilled. Why not be aspirational so to make sure that those with the least opportunities in the community are just as able to get into those jobs as anyone else? That demands a change in the skills system, without a doubt in my mind. The James Withers report on the skills system does open up the possibility to devolve control over some of the skills funding to local and regional levels where the travel to work labour markets exist anyway. Let that be the basis for designing a fresh skills system. I'd also like to think that there are a whole host of organisations that were members of Anna's organisation, like I used to chair the WISE group, and the kind of work that they did in exactly that task of trying to make connections between the most disadvantaged and work opportunities. More of that, please.
Thank you very much, Chuck. So, Chuck, I did do my homework. As you can see in this last slide, kind of really homes in on reducing health inequalities. And if you look at the top part of that, the 40% of it, there's 11 bits in that top box. So I'm not going to go through every single 11 one of them. Poverty is one of them. Yes, it's great giving more money to people, but actually we need to educate and support people and understand how to spend that money, how to spend that well. Coming out of the pandemic, one of the three big things for me, check if I can just kind of throw into this open space, and some of you will already be aware of this. So talk about education, there's a literacy bit to help all of us understand where we are and what we need. Understanding stigma that's attached to some of this as well coming out, and accepting or sharing that there is a problem in certain communities, so understanding that from a diversity perspective. And also oppression. So we know that during the pandemic, if not so, it was more prevalent around the abuse that some individuals were facing, and that's from every element. So understanding that, so those sensitive bits, and that kind of links me into things that we can do ourselves in our roles. So we need long-term investment in prevention. So that's every sector's bit, and Colin and Stuart, you touched on it both about both private and public, and then Anna from a community and volunteer perspective, we need that long-term investment in prevention and sustained collaboration. So what I mean by that, very quickly, is that, you know, we have reviewed when I say we, collectively reviewed the National Performance Framework and around how we work with local systems, regional systems and national systems around policy and service design. And I think if we can do those two well, do those two together, then we'll definitely start to impact more so around the health inequalities. But that's the biggest agenda for Public Health Scotland. Biggest agenda for us, improving life expectancy and reducing health inequalities. That's why we're here.